God, it's been ages since I last shot a video indoors. This is so weird. So before we get started on the topic of today's video, which is the settings that you would use when photographing the Northern Lights, I just firstly want to say a huge thank you to everyone for your kind comments on my recent fungi video. It's the first time I've ever done any sort of videography and proper editing on a video, but next year I have a few projects planned which involve me doing some documentaries for my YouTube channel, potentially interviewing some people and teaching you more about the history and heritage of Scotland, as well as my landscape photography journey. So it was a good opportunity for me to test the idea of doing more videography and video editing, and I'm really glad that you guys enjoyed that. So hopefully more of that sort of theme coming your way in 2020. Right, a few days ago I posted a video where I went Aurora hunting here in Scotland, and a lot of you had asked what camera settings I used to shoot the photographs. So I thought, rather than addressing you all individually, it was a great opportunity for me to produce a video, give you all some guidance and hints and tips of the best settings to use that I've learnt since I've been doing sort of Aurora hunting and Northern Light photography. So without further ado, let's get started on that. And tip number one is always shoot in manual mode. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, us humans really struggle to see in the dark, so it's no wonder that our cameras struggle as well. You need to take full control of your camera to ensure that the maximum amount of light comes into your camera when shooting at night. Unfortunately, auto modes or any other mode apart from manual is not going to work when photographing the Northern Lights, so get your camera onto manual mode. That is tip number one. Tip number two, you need a tripod. So this isn't a setting tip, but in case any of you are watching this and don't own a tripod and want to photograph the Northern Lights, you have got to have a tripod with you. Because of the dark light, you're going to be using settings in your camera that requires you to take a photograph over many seconds, and also the dull light means that you need a static position for your camera to be on to ensure maximum sharpness and to prevent any camera shake. Tip number three, you need to focus your lens to infinity. So a lot of lenses have built-in infinity on them, so if yours does, flick your lens onto manual and focus to infinity. If it doesn't, a few tips of how you can do this is to go out during the daytime with your camera, focus on something really far in the distance, and then keep your lens in that focus for nighttime. Or what I often do is go out earlier than I need to allow me time to mess around with my focus so that it's focused into the distance. And what you want to do is ensure that the stars are pin sharp, and that will allow you to get really interesting images. Because the worst thing is going home and finding out that the stars are blurry. They have to be pin sharp. So ensuring you're focused on them or focused to infinity is a great way to achieve this. Now on to the settings, and tip number four is what aperture to use. So as you're wanting to get as much light into your camera as possible, you need to have the widest aperture that your camera lens will go to. Now for some lenses this will be f2.8 and for some it will be f4, but whatever yours is capable of, just ensure that it's as wide open as it can be. Now many people on my channel are landscape photographers and you may be worried about depth of field, but actually in the dark depth of field doesn't really apply because you don't have that foreground, middle ground and background element, and the dark light means that having a wide open aperture is not going to affect that. So just ensure again you're focused on infinity, aperture is as wide open as possible, and it's going to maximise the amount of light into your camera and maximise your chances of getting a really good image. Tip number five is going to be what shutter speed to use. Now your shutter speed can vary depending on how bright or how dull the northern lights are. Now here in Scotland we tend to get dull shows more often than very, very bright ones. So a good starting point I always find is to set your camera to 20 seconds. And what this does is allows a lot of light into the camera, as well as with your wide open aperture, to allow you to have a better chance of photographing the northern lights. Now because the earth rotates around the sun, sometimes if you have your shutter speed more than 20 seconds, you can end up with the stars moving slightly and creating a bit of a star trail, which isn't always visually appealing. Now if you've got a really bright aurora, you might want to put your shutter speed down to 15 seconds or even 10 seconds. That doesn't happen very often in Scotland, but if you do get that, it's another good way of preventing any of this movement. And there is actually a calculation you can do for your lens to work out the optimum shutter speed to use without having that trail. And I'll put a link in the description to a document or a website that you can look at if you want to get more technical and look into that. And tip number 6 is what ISO to use. Now obviously the higher your ISO is, the more sensitive your camera is to light, which you're wanting when shooting in the dark. But you also don't want your ISO to be too high that your image becomes really, really grainy. So a good starting point I always find is around ISO 1600. And if your image is still quite dull, you can bump that up. I wouldn't necessarily recommend going any higher than 3200, but sort of sticking to that 1600 to start with. If you need to bump it up, do so. And if it's a really bright aurora, you might even want to bring it down to even ISO 800. But start at that 1600 mark, and then you can play around with it as the night progresses. So just to recap, my 6 tips on what settings to use when photographing the northern lights. Tip number 1, ensure your camera is set to manual mode. Number 2, you must have a tripod. Number 3, ensure that your lens is focused on infinity, or if it doesn't have infinity on it, ensure that the stars are pin sharp by moving your focus. Tip number 4, have your aperture open as wide as it can be, whether that's f2.4 or f4. Tip number 5, making sure you've got a long shutter speed, maybe start at about 20 seconds and decrease that if need be. And tip number 6, ensure your ISO is quite high, starting off at about 1600, bump it up if you need to, or take it down if the aurora is really bright. So I hope that those tips will help you to set your camera should you want to go aurora hunting anytime soon. I wish you the best of luck with your aurora hunting journeys. It can be quite challenging. I find astrophotography really challenging. You know, working in low light conditions is a challenge for anyone, and it can take years to master. But getting out there, trying and enjoying it is a really good way to do this. Another tip would be, even if the northern lights aren't out, if it's a nice starry night, it's a really good way of going out and experimenting and getting used to shooting in low light conditions. You can do a lot with photography in terms of a nice bright starry night. So get out there, practice and enjoy it, and it's a really good way to learn and to improve your nighttime photography skills. So as always, I want to say a huge thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you all again next time.